Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Saloni Shah. Saloni is a food and agriculture analyst at the Breakthrough Institute and the co-author alongside Ted Nordhaus of the recent foreign policy piece, "In Sri Lanka, Organic Farming Went Catastrophically Wrong." Saloni, thank you so much for coming on, making the time for Decouple today.
Thank you for having me.
So Saloni, we do a bit of a self-introduction as well. I kept it pretty brief there, so help our audience get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I'm an analyst in the Food and Agriculture program at the Breakthrough Institute. The Breakthrough is an environmental think tank that advocates for technological solutions to environmental problems. And I've been long interested in issues at the intersection of agriculture, climate, food security, and innovation. So, I studied environmental science and analysis and policy, which gave me a really strong kind of background in forests and land use, and then came to Breakthrough to apply that knowledge and work on policy.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. I mean, so I've had some. We've been dabbling in agricultural themes for a while now. Had some great guests like Dr. Prakash. We had Kenneth Kassman, who's also affiliated with the Breakthrough Institute. Most recently, and I guess kind of most worryingly, I had Doomberg on, the anonymous green chicken. They wrote a great piece called "Farmers on the Brink," and really went through this perfect storm heading towards the world agricultural system. And that has a lot to do with probably botched energy policy and of course, the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But Sri Lanka and its experiment that we're going to be talking about today seem to be particularly pertinent, something I've been dying to dive into because it's kind of the canary in the coal mine, I think, for a lot of what the world is about to face. As a country that sort of did this experiment of banning synthetic agricultural inputs. So, I'm really, really excited to be able to deep dive this, and I hope it's not too much of a kind of premonition for what's going to be coming in the years ahead, particularly to low-income countries. But maybe we can start off just by, I guess, kind of laying the scene for we have a very international audience, but let's just get some background on Sri Lanka as a country. We don't need to deep dive the history or anything, but from what I understand, it's a middle income country. People I think have heard of the civil war there and the Tamil Tigers and things like that. But if you can just give us a little bit of a background, just to ground people in this conversation.
Of course. I think the important thing to consider and remember here is that Sri Lanka was designated as an upper middle income country a few years ago. And so out of, the South Asian kind of Asian region of the world, it had been doing fairly well. The ag sector had enjoyed subsidies and increased yields. They had achieved self-sufficiency in rice, which is a huge accomplishment for such a small country that doesn't have a lot of land. Back in the early 2000s, many people had moved into the formal wage economy, and standards of living have been rising. It was considered a pretty rich country that enjoyed, a surplus of kind of agriculture, and farmers kind of benefit from these policies. But recently the government took a very protectionist turn and started to ban imports. And the Rajapaksa kind of family came into power a few decades ago. And since they entered, there's been, decades of financial mismanagement, rising debt as they've, essentially traded cheap debt for infrastructure development, some of which has not been as profitable as people hoped. And so you have a country, you have a government that has also been plagued by corruption and voter fraud. And so, enter the current president. He won the election, won in a lot of Buddhist majority areas, and he was able to rise to prominence as a managerial technocrat due to the platform that was provided to him by the Viet Maga. The Viet Maga is a think tank of sorts in Sri Lanka that has this goal of promoting the moral and material sort of development of Sri Lanka. And he was able to fashion himself this way because of this influential and prominent group that had also created his election platform for him called the Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor. And so you have a country that is really trying to continue on this path of upper middle income development. And comes the Rajapaksa family that implemented policies that resulted in kind of negative economic impacts. The pandemic hits. this really disrupts the tourist sector and remittances, which also leads to this foreign exchange crisis, which we can also get into.
For sure. Yeah, yeah. I understand. I think tourism's like something like 50% of foreign reserves, or in terms of generating income. Something I'm really fascinated by, with this, because I think there's many angles to this. There's a narrative that, this is kind of outside influences, the Vandana Shivas of the world, the agroecology movement, sort of, when I didn't have as deep of an understanding of this issue, I thought that was kind of mainly where this was coming from. Because, the narrative I have around the organic food movement is that it's, very much the production of, the world's, urban elites essentially, and their sort of eco-romanticism, and those kind of narratives seem to fit there in a way that didn't make sense for me in a country that's, more of a developing world country. These fears of, contamination and toxins and things like that. It just seems to be so much of a, more of a Western issue. Not that those issues don't affect people all over the world, but, at certain levels of development, one can develop different preoccupations. So I was curious as to, where this comes from within the Sri Lankan context. So I'm not sure if you can unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, you're right to point out that on the Western side, many urbanites are seducted to this idea of organic being safer and having no pesticides, and are willing to pay, premium prices. But for a country like Sri Lanka, the economics of this is untenable, right? Because they rely on agriculture as a source of export income and for their food security. So, it's really puzzling. Why would a low and middle income country implement this kind of policy, given how important the ag sector is? 75% of rural people are employed in the sector. And it's a combination of a couple things. Looking back at the glyphosate ban in 2015 that was imposed by the country, a lot of that was motivated by fears around chronic kidney disease and some of the environmental and public health concerns around fertilizers and pesticides. And this is a controversial topic, a very highly sensitive topic, and this disease tends to plague rural agricultural communities in Sri Lanka. And so, in a bid to try to minimize these health problems, and to also back then save money from and reduce their import bill for fertilizers, they imposed this glyphosate ban, which is a herbicide that helps to control weeds especially on tea plantations there. And it turned out that a third of their farmlands were abandoned by farmers, and the government ends up lifting this ban. There was also a lot of illegal products that were illegal, kind of pesticides and fertilizers that were coming in as a result. So there's already been this like long history of sensitivity around chemical use that helps to fuel anti-chemical sentiments. And there's also this influential medical association called the Governor Medical Association. Actually, well, their nickname is
Throw in the show notes.
GMOA.
Yeah.
Yes, we can throw in the show notes. And the president of that was actually on a task force, one of the task forces that helped to kind of speed up the implementation of this ban. And he had long advocated against agrochemicals. And so in the Sri Lankan discourse, political and public discourse, there is a lot of capture around agrochemicals kind of causing these diseases, but there's a lack of conclusive kind of evidence and availability of evidence for people on why this is happening. And so I think people kind of forget that, with the rational use and sufficient and safe use of fertilizers, with proper guidelines in place, in the US and in Canada, of course, there are food safety agencies. You can certainly kind of use fertilizer and chemicals responsibly. And there's always going to be a concern around the overuse, and that's a very valid concern. But I think that there needs to be more widely accessible information around how much fertilizer to use, how much pesticides to use. But this is an important issue. I mean, even the ag minister was talking about fears of health concerns due to fertilizer and pesticide use, just to kind of demonstrate the capture that there is around this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it was interesting. I think this link to chronic kidney disease of unknown origin. I looked into that a little bit. I was curious medically, and this Chana Jaya Sumana guy, because he became the minister of health, but prior and around the time of the glyphosate ban, he'd I think published in a kind of pay to play journal, nothing peer reviewed, but you make these kind of links, and it fits into a kind of popular gestalt, I guess. it's so interesting because when I was talking to Dr. Chana Prakash, who's a huge fan of Norman Borlaug and kind of grew up at the tail end of one of the last big famines in India and really saw the Green Revolution deliver food security and real food independence and independence to the nation, no longer being dependent on food aid. I mean, obviously, we had a great discussion and really got him to sort of steelman the best arguments, against the Green Revolution. There were obviously problems with it and there's challenges, but just the escape from regular famine and starvation would seem to be something that like a middle income country with a historical memory would be a little more careful about avoiding. And it's fascinating to me that they had this experience with the glyphosate ban, which I guess they reversed or partially reversed. They experienced, a real agricultural catastrophe as a result in terms of abandoning large sections of land. And then they did it all over again. So again, it seems part of this was because there was this huge foreign reserve crunch. They weren't getting any, US dollars or whatever the foreign currencies are that are important there from tourism. And this was a way to save $500 million in terms of fertilizer imports and subsidies. Am I getting that right?
You're getting that right. And it turns out when you look at the aftermath of the ban, it costed them more than what they were going to save, right? So looking at the numbers, the fertilizer import bill was around $250 million back in 2020. It was going to be about $300 to $400 million in 2021, combined with subsidizing fertilizers at $250 million. It's about a few percentage points of government spending. When the fertilizer ban was put in place, rice production, tea production, rubber and coconut production were heavily impacted. There are estimates around, 30 to 40% of tea output being impacted. A $425 million economic loss was estimated in the first 6 months of the ban for the tea sector, combined with farmers protesting, and then the government ended up providing compensation, importing hundreds of millions of dollars of rice due to the production shortfall. I think the estimate is around a 14 to 16% drop in domestic rice production from 2021 to 2022. So when you look at all of that, they thought they were going to use this clever move of cutting their import bill, cutting subsidies to stem the slide of the foreign exchange crisis, but it turned out that it ended up costing them more, and it also, partially led to also the food shortages. And like I said before, tea alone brought in around $1.3 billion annually to their economy. So it's an important source of ag export income, especially when your tourist sector is devastated. So they need any kind of export income that they can get to be able to import food, medicine, other critical supplies. Even routine surgeries have been canceled. And also to import fuel, which farmers also need diesel fuel to operate their machinery. So all of this ended up costing more. And you're right. Part of the reason why this ban was implemented so suddenly was to deal with rising costs. But it was a part of this transition to organic farming was a part of the government's election manifesto. They had intended to transition the country over a 10-year period to organic farming and to ramp up production of organic fertilizers. But it turned out when they decided to implement this as suddenly as they did, that they found out that they weren't able to kind of meet the organic fertilizer requirement that they would need for their crops. I crunched some numbers, and it seemed like they would need 5 to 7 times more manure just to offset the amount of synthetic fertilizers that they normally would have used to help meet the crop nutrient requirements. And so all of this ended up costing more. It was short-sighted, but at the same time, this is a part of the plan for the government all along, and it's partially due to the health concerns that we mentioned earlier, and just anti-scientific kind of ideas around farming and romantic notions around farming that we see all across the world, in Sri Lanka and in the Western world too.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you mentioned, this is this 10-year plan, which, may have been less disastrous if put in place over 10 years. There's other precedents for something like Sri Lanka that were entered into, not so much voluntarily. I've spent a lot of time in Cuba over the years, and very acquainted with the Cuban special period when the Soviet Union collapsed and I think their economy GDP shrank by 73%. The average Cuban lost 15 to 20 pounds. And it was interesting because they had a model that was, they ate a lot of canned food from the Soviet Union. They had, a lot of tractors in the fields, mostly doing sugarcane. And they had this total crash. And they were kind of celebrated by the agroecology movement for sort of the desperate measures that they did do, like plowing fields with oxen and these organiponicos, like urban gardens and things like that. I mean, still importing a ton of food. But yeah, I mean, just seeing a nation kind of do this to itself. I mean, surely there were a lot of agronomists and experts saying this is crazy. But like, who's to blame? Like, who are the intellectual authors? Because you've racked up sort of, that this was a losing financial proposition. It's ended up costing far more. And we rattled off a bunch of numbers, but I mean, the human suffering has been enormous. Food prices are through the roof, and I've just been paying a little bit of attention to sort of the riots and things and the instability that's happening right now. But I guess I'm just trying to figure out, domestically and internationally, who are the intellectual authors of this? Who, because I think those folks get off so easily all the time. People that propose these ideas with utter confidence, against the better advice of maybe agronomists and experts that, it's just interesting to me. So yeah, I mean, can you point some fingers, I guess, at the intellectual authorship of this, I guess, call it what it is. I guess it's a bit of a disaster, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's many different kind of. So, of course, there are folks that were on the task forces that advise the government, right? So there are people that have explicit ties to organic farming or in the organic fertilizer industry, or have long advocated for banning agrochemicals. If you look at the composition of the Green Sri Lanka Task Force back in spring 2021, so right, before the ban, you have several folks. If you look up their backgrounds, either academics that are studying biofertilizer development, or how to formulate biofertilizers, or they kind of supply organic fertilizers, or they grow organic tea. The president of the GMOA that I mentioned, gonna get his name wrong, but maybe we can check that later. Dr. Padania, for example, was a long kind of advocate of banning agrochemicals. And you look at also the composition of the task force in October 2021, October 20th, 2021, right after kind of the ban and the impacts were starting to unfold. And you still have people that have explicit ties to kind of trying to manufacture organic fertilizer in the country. So there are obviously folks and advocates of sustainable agriculture within the country that made up the folks that were advising the government, along with the Viet MAGA, who had ignored the sound advice from agronomists and agricultural scientists. But then at the same time, you have, longstanding advocates of organic agriculture all around the world that have promoted organic and alternative agriculture as this sort of idealistic solution that would both reduce environmental impacts, public health impacts, without compromising food security, without impoverishing farmers. And so, we've talked about these people. Channa Jayasuma, not sure how to say his last name, but Dr. Channa Jayasuma, feel free to correct that in the edits, and and Vandana Shiva, who have also captured discourse around this. But I think a lot of the blame can also be placed on the government themselves. I mean, you're going to get advice from a number of people, and it's going to be up to the government to maintain evidence-based policymaking, right? And to also ensure that appropriate stakeholders are heard, and that farmers from various backgrounds are heard. For smallholder farmers that can't navigate the complicated international certification schemes for organic that we have in the U.S. and in Canada and the EU, I mean, for them, being able to increase their harvest to both feed themselves and to also have surplus to sell to market for their own income is important. And so synthetic fertilizers will absolutely be important. So, we can point fingers. I think there's a long-standing kind of infiltration of organic, farming dogma in Sri Lanka and all over the world from a combination of people. And I do think it's going to be up to governments and up to even the UN system. I think the UNDP, UN Development Program, has long kind of called for reducing fertilizer use around the world too. So it's going to be up to kind of institutions, I think, to make sure that they are getting sound advice and that they're listening to all stakeholders and really putting everything in perspective here. Organic farming makes about 2.5% of land in Sri Lanka. Some farmers may benefit from it if they can, sell to international markets at a premium, and it can be lucrative business. But for the vast majority of farmers that are looking to, increase their incomes, kind of increase their well-being, and also sell to market, pesticides and fertilizers are just a part of the business and a critical part of agriculture. So I think we can definitely point fingers, but the government has, responsibility to its people to understand what the realities are of their ag sector and of their economy. It's a developing country, right? Um, that would be that would be my answer,
Yeah.
my long
No, no,
rambling
fair,
answer.
fair. No, no, it's all good. I mean, something you said earlier that the experts were saying they would need to have something like a 7 times increase in the amount of animal manure available. I mean, there's this question. We know that the Haber-Bosch process provides the ammonia, the nitrogen, responsible for 4 billion bodies of humanity. Essentially, like 50% of humanity is here because of Haber-Bosch, in terms of the nitrogen that makes up the proteins that allows us to exist as the organisms that we are. And the substitution of that is pretty wild. I mean, going back in the history of agriculture, I guess you have, before inputs you had guano, and then this Haber-Bosch process. But the replacement of that struck me as interesting. In the article, you and Ted talk about sort of the thermodynamics of farming. So could we step back and maybe you give us that abstract take? Because I think when you go back to first principles here, it's really helpful. Like we've been in the headlines a bit. We've talked about some of the cast of characters, but that bit on sort of the thermodynamics of agriculture, I thought was a useful first principles to unpack this and understand the enormity of trying to swap out another source of nitrogen essentially for synthetic nitrogen.
Yeah, before synthetic fertilizers, you're relying essentially on guano, animal manure, right? And organic fertilizer, the composition, the nutrient content is just entirely different from the synthetic fertilizers that we were able to start producing in the 1900s, early 1900s. I mean, synthetic fertilizer tends to have has a higher nutrient content, and it's able to disperse nutrients much more quickly to crops. And so as a result, you were able to see a rapid increase in yields, and this allowed us to feed more people, but it also allowed economies to develop as agricultural productivity increased. And so you saw human labor shift from agriculture to sectors that could offer higher incomes and a better quality of life. And as you said, now about 500,000 people depend on synthetic fertilizer. And so with both synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, modern plant breeding, irrigation, large scale irrigation systems, we were able to see that food production, agriculture output actually tripled after World War II, and land use only increased by 30% in that same time period. So we were able to produce more food while also minimizing land use and environmental impacts. Organic farming, as you know, tends to have lower, or has on average 20% lower yields than conventional farming. And so if you were to make up for that shortfall in production, you'd have to expand land. And so I think it's important to remember that with the modern tools that we have available, the ag sector was able to just increase, or was able to become way more productive than it ever has, and as a result, you were able to see flourishing of countries and economies all around the world, increasing food self-sufficiency, and this allowed for a better quality of life, right? So if you use machinery and pesticides, you can reduce human labor as well on the farm. Weeding is a really laborious task, and so there are a lot of benefits that were provided by conventional farming, and I think that in our kind of environmental discourse today, many people do tend to focus on the overuse of chemicals in farming, and that's a legitimate concern. But we also need to remember the benefits that modern agriculture has provided to society as well.
Hmm, hmm. There's this idea, I think, of kind of the organic sector freeloading on the conventional sector for its inputs, particularly if you're going to be using manure, right? And within the EU, where there's a ban on genetically engineered food all over the place, a lot of the animal feed is genetically engineered soybean, but it's purified by the digestive tract of the animals that eat it. They're a lot of the animals and animal agriculture in the EU is based upon feeding them, Brazilian GMO soybeans. But then the manure is all of a sudden organic, and that becomes a source of organic fertilizer. So I think that's a really interesting question, right? I mean, the sort of conventional side is producing this abundance not only of food but also of nutrients in the form of animal manure, and then that's being used. So what did Sri Lanka do to try and fill that gap that was emerging in terms of meeting those basic plant nutrient needs?
They realized they had to import organic fertilizer. On a small, tiny country, there is not going to be enough organic fertilizer and manure already there to supply the nutrients. I mean, supply the nutrients that are needed. I mean, this is a Herculean task that they were trying to implement here. They were never going to have enough organic fertilizer. So they try to import organic fertilizer from other countries. They imported a seaweed-based fertilizer from China, which led to a diplomatic spat because the Sri Lankan government deemed the organic fertilizer shipment to be unsafe and harmful and full of pathogens that would impact their crops. And so, they realized that, in the fall, as their synthetic fertilizer supply was dwindling, as they had difficulties importing organic fertilizer, because organic fertilizers can be made from a number of things, right? Manure, crop residues, and it could be compost, which could also have certain trace ingredients which may or may not be safe. They realized that they had to start importing synthetic fertilizer again. They started importing potassium chloride, which they claimed was organic, but it was not. They're importing this from Lithuania, and they ended up partially reversing the ban for key export crops like tea. And so they quickly realized that they weren't going to have enough organic fertilizer, especially on a country that doesn't have as much land. Here in the US and Canada, we have a lot of land, so we can maybe produce a good amount of manure, but it's still not going to be enough to meet the nutrient requirements of these crops, especially for tea and rice, which are even more heavily dependent on synthetic fertilizers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I
All
mean,
the
I'm
elements.
just
So
also thinking about like the distribution of like seaweed or of animal manure. Like it's not dense. It's not physically as compact as like a sack of ammonia nitrate or whatever. Maybe I'm saying that wrong, like, exposing my ignorance here. But like it just seems like total madness to say, okay, from one year to the next, we're getting rid of all synthetic inputs. We're gonna completely change our model for how we get our plant nutrients, like the distribution networks that would be required to, the trucking to ship around, like just these enormous amounts of manure to spread it all over these huge fields. I mean, like who could have seen this coming, and like who didn't? And you know what I mean? And it seems to be leading to some real tragedy. And I think, they started with a debt crisis. As you're mentioning, it sounds like Sri Lanka's deep in debt because they, to China particularly because of the infrastructure projects. This has not helped their foreign reserves. And now they're heading into next year where fertilizer prices are absolutely astronomical and through the roof, as well as all the other kind of inputs, with, I guess potash, being sanctioned in Russia and Belarus, and, all the stuff we talked about with Doomberg a couple episodes ago. I mean, this is not looking pretty. What's going on? What's going on politically in terms of unrest in Sri Lanka right now? And I mean, like, what's the way out of it? I'm not trying to ask you to make the policy solutions here, but maybe just what's the latest? What's the political result of this been? And maybe what does that infer for what we're going to be seeing in other parts of the world that are struggling with a fertilizer shortage that's not a political choice but an economic one?
The country and its people are angry. I mean, they erupted into widespread protests, as you know, because of food, fuel, shortages and shortages of other critical items. They're angry with the government, and especially the Rajapaksa family. And the protests actually prompted the entire cabinet to resign. And there's calls for both President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa to resign and to leave, and for there to be a new government providing reforms. And the country is also trying to get itself out of the debt crisis and meet with the International Monetary Fund to negotiate a financial rescue package. I mean, this economic crisis spiraled, and now they're dealing with a political crisis, as you see now, and people are angry. And ironically, unfortunately, the Rajapaksa family, they still have the military, they still have some legislators that are behind them, and so they are sort of in a position where people are calling for them to resign, but because they still have this. They still have a power and a hold over the military and parts of the government, so they're still in power. And so I think that there's going to be a combination of things that are needed. I'm hopeful that since people are kind of protesting and calling for large-scale change, that there might be reforms and that the Rajapaksa family might resign. But it's we don't know what's going to happen. There's a lot of, due to the past kind of protests and riots, the brothers and the family are implicated kind of, I think, in a human rights um, implicated in kind of human rights abuses as well. So it's hard to tell what will happen, but I'm hopeful that there can be change. But the country in the meantime is suffering. I mean, there's blackouts that are lasting 13 hours because of lack of fuel. And due to food shortages, people are really suffering, and due to the inflation and depreciating currency, that's putting an even greater pinch on people, and their incomes are dwindling along with that of the country. And so they're really in need of a financial rescue. And this is not the first time that they've kind of negotiated a financial rescue package as well with the IMF. And so it's clear that it's clear that really large changes needed. I think some analysts are calling this potentially the worst economic and political crisis since independence, and that they're also saying that it could be the next Arab Spring. So I don't know what will happen, but I'm hoping that there is large scale reform that's in the interests of its people.
Hmm. And I guess, I
And
mean,
China and India have.
Arab Spring coincided as well with skyrocketing food prices, I think, after the 2008 financial crisis. So that
Exactly.
fits. I mean,
And
what about, are folks like Vandana Shiva, are they owning this? Have they gone quiet? Like, where are the agroecological movement leaders? What are they saying about Sri Lanka? Um, is there any narrative that they got it wrong because they didn't do it this exact way that it was prescribed, or are they just quiet? What are you seeing?
so far, I've seen folks like Vandana Shiva be quiet, or I've seen some articles arguing that this was just a hastily imposed ban, and if they had, imposed this over a longer period of time and worked to develop the organic fertilizer production capacity and had trained farmers in organic practices and imposed a regulatory framework, that they could have pulled this off. But in short, no one has pulled this off, and especially for a low and middle income country, um, trying to pull that off is disastrous, and has large scale economic and political and environmental consequences, as we've seen. So, and even the EU has struggled to try to transition to organic farming. And there have been states in India that have announced transitioning to organic farming completely. Bhutan lost a couple percentage points on their GDP as a result, and higher, household purchasing power also declined from trying to phase out chemical use in organic farming. And so, um, can you remind me of your question? I think I want
No,
to make
just
sure I
just
got.
if the kind of intellectual authors of what's happened in Sri Lanka are taking ownership or finding excuses or.
In short, no, they have not. In short, no. I mean, it seems like the country, based off the task forces that they have established, even after the economic consequences, they still want to go down this path of transitioning the country to organic farming and kind of see it as improving the environmental and public health of their country, despite the economic consequences that we've seen and the consequences to the country's food security. They have to import rice now, and so no, they haven't. Surprisingly, I think overall. I mean, maybe there's private conversations, but in the public sphere, they have not owned up to this crisis.
I think sometimes like the narratives that I hear, the critiques I hear of this process sound like an argument for the status quo. And just that this is a sort of pro agro business kind of institute that you're working with at the Breakthrough Institute, for instance. What is the answer? Just simply to kind of maintain that status quo, or there are legitimate concerns, obviously, with eutrophication and over application of synthetic fertilizers. So, what is the way forward? There's obviously this idea of we can return to a Garden of Eden by going back to kind of ancient techniques. What are the alternatives, I guess?
Yeah, the status quo is also not enough, right? It's important to, yes, both increase yields and to minimize environmental impacts. And that's going to require a combination, I think, of both technology and appropriate policies, especially in low and middle income countries that are really experiencing a pinch from rising fertilizer and fuel costs. And so, on the innovation side, of course, at the Breakthrough, we've advocated for both kind of using precision agricultural technologies, which allow farmers to target fertilizer use and increase yields while minimizing fertilizer. And for low and middle income countries, these sorts of technologies are certainly expensive, but there's a lot the government can do to start kind of incentivizing the use of these technologies and reducing the costs of them as well. We've also seen some promising, bioengineered microbial soil treatments that can help fix nitrogen in the soil and reduce the need for fertilizers as well. And we've talked about genetic engineered crops that can also help to reduce dependence on fertilizers. So there's a lot that can happen on the tech and innovation side. Governments can also, implement, smarter and targeted subsidy policies, and also increase agricultural extension services, and provide farmers with appropriate advice on how much fertilizer to use, how much fertilizer to use, and what kinds of fertilizer to use as well, and for what kinds of crops. And that sort of advice can help to discourage and disincentivize the overuse of fertilizers that we see as well. And there's also integrated pest management and different techniques that can help to that when used in conjunction with agrochemicals can help to kind of discourage the overuse of fertilizers as well. So I think it'll be a combination of, both making sure that there's an active kind of public sector actor here that's working with farmers to ensure that the right amount of fertilizers are used, but also, further innovation and technological development could help to, reduce fertilizer use as well. If you look at the average fertilizer use in the United States and in India, more fertilizers are used in India than in the US. And that's because farmers have been able to increase yields using technologies while also, using the appropriate or amount of fertilizer use, and not overusing these chemicals as well. So I think that there is a future that's possible, that's better than the status quo, that utilizes both kind of low cost methods of just providing the appropriate advice to farmers, and looking at techniques to target fertilizer use. And then there's also technologies and innovations that can help to further target pesticide and fertilizer use as well. I think that there's a new kind of future here that's not just the sort of pro agribusiness sort of side of things, and pro just only technology, but and there also isn't this there's a future that isn't just the whole Garden of Eden utopia where you don't need to use any chemical inputs to improve agriculture. I think that we could go and find a more outcomes kind of based approach that is not mired by any kind of ideology, and that's centered around both helping farmers increase output, increase incomes, but also improve the sustainability of agriculture too.
Hmm. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up, Saloni. Thank you for shining a light on this important
Thank you.
example, and hopefully one that's not going to be too reflective of what the global South or poor nations in general feature with a this was a policy based error, and I guess we're going to see high fertilizer prices around the world, and it'll be interesting to see how countries respond, and whether Sri Lanka is the canary in the coal mine. Thanks again for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.